Welcome to Perspectives, a podcast from Zeit Contemporary Art, exploring art and its ideas. I'm your host, Samuel Shapiro. Sol LeWitt was a pivotal figure in the development of minimal and conceptual art, and catalytic in the relay between the two. You couldn't write a textbook of 20th century art history without discussing him. Yet the full complexity of his artistic innovations is rarely attended to beyond the confines of academia. Perhaps because of that complexity, he doesn't figure into the public consciousness as much as many of his post-war peers, although not for lack of exposure. There is an entire building dedicated to LeWitt's wall drawings at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, and his modular sculptures grace grounds from the National Gallery of Art to Stormking. So who was Sol LeWitt? How can we reconcile his serial sculptures with his delicate hand-painted gouaches, his folded paper drawings with large-scale instruction-based wall drawings? What did LeWitt mean when he said that the idea becomes a machine that makes the art? And when he said that conceptual artists are mystics rather than rationalists? How is it that his art has been claimed to represent both a kind of impersonal logic and a mad obsessiveness? To work through these questions and more, I spoke to Janet Pacelle and Cristina Guadalupe Galvan. Janet Pacelle has been curator of the Sol LeWitt collection since 1991. She worked closely with LeWitt towards the end of his life and continues to oversee his art collection and archive. She's facilitated hundreds of gallery and museum exhibitions featuring LeWitt's work, including the major retrospective organized by the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in 2000. In addition to being a true authority on the artist with an intimate knowledge of his life and work, Janet is herself a practicing artist and has exhibited across the United States and Europe, from Mass MoCA to the Staatsgalerie Stuttgart. Cristina Guadalupe Galvan is an artist and architect who writes. She is the principal at Idée Fixe, a transdisciplinary studio of art and architecture, and has worked at a number of other architectural firms supporting such luminaries as Dan Graham and Denise Scott Brown. In addition to architecture, stage design, and exhibition design, Cristina has shown visual art from New York to Tokyo and written extensively on subjects from urban planning to Sol LeWitt. Together, we discuss LeWitt's early work and the developmental arc of his career, the relationship he constructed between art, architecture, and language, his legacy as a collector, and his meaning for artists today. And now, it's my pleasure to share with you Janet Pacelle and Cristina Guadalupe Galvan's perspectives. Janet and Cristina, thank you both so much for coming on Perspectives. You encountered Sol LeWitt's work in different ways and at different times. I'd love it if you both could share a bit about your first LeWitt encounters. Janet, to start with you, did you encounter LeWitt first or his work first?
I encountered his work first. I was getting ready to go to art school. Must have been about, I think it was 1982, and the Wadsworth Atheneum had a big show of Sol LeWitt wall drawings. I read about it in the paper, and I was getting ready to go to art school, and this sounded like something very different from any kind of art that I had encountered before. So I thought, well, this will be interesting. I'll go and see. I went to the museum, and I was really literally blown away. I felt like the universe expanded right around me, and I was ecstatic. I read every single label, every word of every label, every wall drawing, and looked at the wall drawing, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was thrilled. So I kind of packed that into, my mind and went to school for 4 years. When I got out, I started working part-time at the Wadsworth Atheneum in the curatorial department, and eventually became a curatorial assistant in the Department of Contemporary Art. Meantime, Sol LeWitt had been storing his collection at the Wadsworth Atheneum once he collected so much work that it kind of overran his studio. Anyway, I started working for the Department of Contemporary Art, and part of my job was to work with the objects in the LeWitt collection. So I met Sol at that point, and I really consider that my art education in some ways began with my work with the LeWitt collection. And it was absolutely enlightening and inspiring. So when I decided to leave my job at the Wadsworth, I called Sol, and Sol was a very shy man, and I had met him a few times. I was a shy person, and I said, Mr. LeWitt, and of course he said, call me Sol. And Mr. LeWitt, I'm leaving my job, and but I really admire your collection. And if there's ever anything I can do, please let me know. And he said, why don't you come work for me in Chester? There's nobody here cataloging the work and, et cetera. And how much would you like to make? And that was, it was just like that. And so I started working, coming to Chester, and really there was a small amount of work there. We had a small warehouse, and everything just mushroomed over. That was 1991, I guess. So I've been there ever since, here ever since.
And Christina, are there any particularly meaningful interactions with his work that you remember?
There's one, actually. I came fairly late to his work when I moved to the US, actually, 12 years ago. And I had an aha moment at Dia Beacon when there was like a temporary installation of some of the wall drawings. And I remember especially the really early ones. I think they're called like 4 basic kind of straight lines and other combinations. And I just had graduated from architecture in Barcelona and moved here. And when I encountered this work, it was like, okay, there's something here. I had shivers, like it was really an encounter. So I started to dig in the character and the work. I went to Mass MoCA, taking 4 buses from Boston. Like, I don't know, it was like a journey for me. And as I was discovering myself as an artist, architect, like diving into Sol LeWitt's work and person and universe, it's been like a teaching experience, even though I never met him like Janet has. I wish I had, but this is a bit my story with his work.
Over the course of that journey, did your understanding of his art remain constant? Did you come to see multiple LeWitts, or did it all hold together?
It just was like, like a notion that was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And like, it helped me understand myself, understand his work. His work is, is so luscious, the wall drawings and the later period more. But the work is so conceptual that it's very misleading, because you are first seduced by the eye, but the real substance is the mind. So the more I learn about it, the more I discover the work for real, and the more I was like appalled by all the dimensions it had.
So I want to ask about 3 directions in which LeWitt's early work pointed. Sculpture, particularly minimalist sculpture, as it was being developed by and around him in the 1960s. Architecture, both as a condition to which LeWitt's work occasionally aspired, and as a key component of many of his work, especially the wall drawings. And language, both in terms of LeWitt's important writings, like the paragraphs and sentences on conceptual art, and in terms of the presence of language within his works. Maybe to start with sculpture, LeWitt rejected the notion of sculpture as something autonomous on a pedestal that needs to be seen in the round. Instead, his sculptures, sometimes taking the form of open squares that frame floors or corners, open onto its architectural container. And rather than following a logic of illusionistic representation, his sculptures often are demonstrations of geometrical principles, like the possible combinations and permutations of an unfinished cube. How does this type of sculpture relate to the type of work that LeWitt saw around him being produced both before and after him?
He was very influenced by, for example, Frank Stella, and works that he saw by Frank Stella, where there was a hole cut out in the canvas and you could see the wall through. And he found that really witty. And he was doing, before he was actually drawing on the wall, he was doing these open cube structures that went on the wall, which he said later were already drawings on the wall, but they were drawings in 3D. And they were using, his basic principles of vertical and horizontal lines. So, his use of these minimal forms was coming from a specific place that wasn't necessarily the place where other people were using minimal forms at the time.
In what way, if you don't mind my asking?
Well, in the way that I said, it was coming from the vocabulary that he had developed for himself and that he was following through in its various permutations. So it was really coming from his own mind, his own philosophy, his own perceptions. philosophical kind of conversation that he was having with 2 and 3 dimensions and that kind of vocabulary.
And do you know if there was a particular mode of philosophy that he was interested in at the time?
I don't know that there was a particular mode of philosophy that he ascribed to. He was very, very well read. And he also was extremely well versed in art history and had traveled widely and seen all the great art and remembered it and seen all the great architecture. So it was coming from all of these different places. And I think that Sol's mind, he was a philosopher himself. He just had a philosophical mind.
I'd like to say a lot of things. But I want to start with a quote that is from Guillaume Apollinaire from his book, The Cubist Painters from 1916. And it says, as soon as culture distances herself from nature, it becomes architecture. Minimalist artists, they all use architecture as a way to distance themselves from abstract expressionism. They all were working at MoMA at the time. Sol was working at MoMA, Mangold, Flavin, Lucy Lippard, and what I'm saying is that at MoMA, the art shows at the time were mainly abstract expressionist shows, but you had the architecture department there that had these amazing shows. And I was reading in MoMA catalog, you had Tourne Le Corbusier, Lucan, Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, modern architecture. And I think because of the separate disciplines in scholarship, this has been lost. There's a couple articles from Lucy Lippard on architecture follies from the late 60s or beginning of the 70s that is so eye-opening. Then Sol went on to work for IMP. And I want to read you a couple of quotes because it's Sol LeWitt's early work. First says, architecture and sculpture are related. The function always stands in the way to prevent an architect to become a sculptor. And I was smiling because I called the essay The Architect Without Function. Another quote, and this is so Sol. I often like to make the comparison, speaking of his architecture, with the music of Bach, constant variations of a simple thing. And that's like the constant variations of the cube idea, for example. This is space ethos, and it's the heart of LeWitt's work. And LeWitt always says that his thinking derived from the history of architecture rather than the history of art, and that meeting and working with architects was so fundamental for him. And then another quote, you have to learn to eliminate and come to the heart of the problem. That's Sol, and also the minimalists, no? Like this elimination and reductivism they were saying. I think that's very important for the art of the second half of the 20th century. I believe is incredibly anchored in architecture. And we see it with contemporary art today. So spatial, so environmental. And I think Sol is at the origin of all this.
Well, thank you for situating his work in that architectural context. I do have to ask then, why wasn't he an architect? I mean, he did say in the paragraphs in Conceptual Art that architecture and three-dimensional art are of completely opposite natures.
One of the things he disliked about architecture and design was that you're continuously coming up with proposals and designing things and designing things and designing things, and most of the time they were rejected. They didn't happen, and there was all this discussion, all this kinds of stuff, but it was not very fruitful. So I think that was certainly something that he was not on board with. It was a lot of work that ended up seeming kind of pointless and not coming to fruition.
And I read that he actually built one building, the synagogue, in Connecticut. There's a synagogue that he, together with an architect, did the design for. I think it was where he would go. It's his own temple. So he built that. And he said that was enough.
Yeah. He did. He designed with the architect Steve Lloyd. He designed a beautiful synagogue in Chester, Connecticut, and yes, it was a major project, beautifully realized. Basically, having to please a whole lot of people, and that's exactly what artists don't want to be doing.
Look, I'm an artist and an architect, and and at the end of the day, and the more and more actually, architecture is losing so much. It's creative and cultural and intellectual. It's becoming so corporate. And at the end, if you're more an artist, there is creativity and problem solving, but Sol is an artist, and architecture entails a lot of practical things, a lot of how do you say administrative things, bureaucratical things, and it's a drag. I agree. I love art because you don't have a client, you can do whatever you want, and I think Sol really liked to do whatever he wants. Something I got.
He did. See, you never met him, but you know that about him. Absolutely. He really had a mind of his own.
Well, so then I'd love to specify what exactly it was that he wanted to pull from architecture into visual art and sculpture in particular. Was it the mode of address that architecture allows? Was it the type of materials or fabrication? What about it, do you think?
It's a mindset. Architecture is an art at the end of the day. In the Renaissance, they were much more together than today. The modernist period really separated those two a lot. But, geometric abstraction was born with the Russian constructivism, and that was the revolution in architecture, art, and design. They were intertwined since the beginning.
I think it was more that these practices, he experienced these practices and they resonated with him and with everything else that resonated with him, like the Russian constructivists, for example. And then he sat down at his table and he began to work. And he was, of course, as Christina said, reacting against the emotionalism and especially for Sol, the heroicism of the abstract expressionists, and wanting to do something that was cooler and less less self-aggrandizing. But I feel like it's a little bit of a mistake to think that most artists set out with this programmatic idea, like this is like I have worked in architecture and this is what I see now happening and how I want to reference architecture. I think in Sol's case, it was really intuitive, and he says that in his sentences on conceptual art. The artist is a mystic, art is intuitive. So it was more of a sort of gathering of all this knowledge, and of course Bach absolutely was fundamental. But these were all things that influenced him, and as he worked, then he sees these connections playing out, and they become a way to explain to himself and to everybody else what he's doing.
Absolutely.
He called his sculptures structures. Mm-hmm. And he said about these pieces and later pieces, if I knew what they were going to look like, they'd be sculptures. So he created these, and because they had the long block, the length of the block, and the irregularity of the progressions, they became extremely organic. And they're remarkably organic for something built with a rectangular block. And at that time that he did that, his gouaches and his work was becoming much more organic. He had been interested in bringing more curved forms into his work. And that eventually led to, he had the carved out kind of complex form structures, which were also very organic in their own way. And then the late pieces, like what you may have seen on the roof of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the swatches, the colorful, that almost are like melting ice cream kind of form.
Oh, yeah.
But they come from this beginning. And
no way.
So, that's the power and the beauty of Sol's work and his body of work that extended from the 1960s to 2007 and never became stale and was always new, and yet always hewed to the beginnings in just ecstatic ways.
Conceptual art in general, and probably LeWitt's work in particular, can have a reputation for being cold and impersonal. What kind of emotional responses do you associate with LeWitt's work? How would you describe the affective dimension?
I believe Sol's work is absolutely emotional. All art is emotional. I mean, all artists make art with their heart and their gut. It is going to be good. And that's your emotional self. Like, if not, in my opinion, well, it's going to be cold, but an apple can be cold if you don't do it. It's the intention how you do it. Every artist has its own language, and I feel when people say it's cold, or Donald Judd might be the coldest of all these people, and I love Donald Judd's work. I want to say I really like him. I think he's more of a modernist and the more architect of all those artists. But even with Judd's work, I get emotional because the sense of proportion, geometry, repetition, composition, materiality, it's like it does speak. So I think it depends of the sensibility of the viewer, because I think every artist makes his art with emotion. That's a no. I don't know. That's what I think.
I think you're absolutely right that it is up to the sensibility of the viewer. And Sol always said the artist isn't responsible for the viewer's reaction. You can't control how the viewer responds. And I agree again with Christina that many of us are very, very deeply moved by what other people might find austere or even cold. Sol's body of work did have the advantage of becoming also very optically pleasing as time went on. The way he combined those primary colors to create all these beautiful, rich colors. So that for some people, the response is really a response to this kind of beauty, and for others, there is a response to the intellectual beauty behind the work as well. I don't think, I can't find any coldness there. There's also the wit, which we talked about, the humor, and the letting in of people to his mind. That's really not something to be taken lightly. And in a 1978 interview with Alicia Legg and Bernice Rose, the question was asked of Sol, do you think your work is emotional? And he said, yes. And he said, I don't know how to explain that, but yes. And I think he's absolutely right from both the maker standpoint and the receiver standpoint.
You both mentioned Soviet constructivism, which of course was part of a broader political project to forge a new type of art for a new type of society. In LeWitt's drawing upon that precedent in the early 60s, do you see a similar politics in his own work? How was he refashioning the tools of constructivism?
Mm-hmm. I think it was not so political for the artists that, were inspired in Russian constructivism. It was political in Russia, definitely, and in Europe in general. But I think when it comes here, it comes more as a language than a political tool.
Sol was very political, but he was not, I don't think, making any kind of deliberate political statement in his art. I mean, it almost is inevitable when you use a particular form in your art. You can always ascribe some kind of political implications, but that wasn't why he was using those forms. Not for, as we're talking about what the Russian, politics was, talking about politics in that way. That wasn't what he was doing. I think Christina is right. It was bringing a language and using that to create a new language or expand and extend that language.
Let's talk about language.
Let's talk about language.
Okay. All right, you go first.
Okay. Dan says that in the early 60s, all those minimal artists were all artist writers. They all saw themselves as writers. And they all want to write. From Lawrence Weiner started as a poet. Carl Andre started writing as well. Dan wrote a lot. Like they all, like it was kind of like the thing a little bit. And so I think that's why we found language in his early work, because it's influenced by this kind of atmosphere.
One can't really have a conversation about Sol LeWitt without taking up the notion of the idea. As LeWitt famously said, the idea becomes a machine that makes the art. This centrality of the idea, this primacy of the intellectual over the material, became the basis for conceptual art. I want to ask you both two questions about the idea. First, how do you understand the relationship between ideas and their material realization in LeWitt's art? He said that what the work of art looks like isn't too important, and yet the consistency of formal elements and articulations in his work belies a certain visual preoccupation.
Sol didn't consider, for example, the wall drawings fully realized were finished until they had been actually realized on the wall. So he wasn't negating the idea of the object, of the actual final, as he said, compunctory affair, I think he called it.
Perfunctory.
Perfunctory. I knew that didn't sound right. Perfunctory affair. So it wasn't that the art, that the final realization that allowed this experience with the work, the greater experience with the idea, it wasn't that wasn't important, but it was that you begin with an idea, and the idea can live on its own, and that the idea is it's the foundation. And a lot of it had to do with, once you set the idea, you don't then change your idea as you go along, because then you're making subjective decisions. So the idea is really the grounding, the parameters, basically, the strict parameters with which you then create the work.
And I have something to say that I just thought right now as you were talking, Janet. And I think actually there's a lot of humor in Sol's work, and it lies exactly there, actually, in the transition from the idea to the object, or to the built reality. It's like I don't know, this is a very personal interpretation, but he's like a kid playing. What happens if I do this? And wow. And what happens if I change this and this and this? Is like, wow, and I don't know. And I think for me, there's a lot of humor and playfulness in that. As he said in his paragraphs, the conceptual artist is not here to bore the audience, no? And of course, it's very important, the physical experience. If not, it's just an idea. It's not art, no? Like, if it's art when it's something concrete. And I personally like conceptual art when its physical realization is as powerful as the idea. If not, it's boring, as Sol kind of said. And his genius is that the idea is incredibly powerful, that the result is incredibly luscious and sensual and appealing at an emotional and physical level. And his genius idea is that it can live after him forever, which is like genius.
Thank you for bringing up the idea of humor, because I agree, and he was a very witty person, and his work is very witty. And when you see some of these series played out, they are funny, and it's kind of odd. And that speaks to also the artist. He always said the idea is intuitive. The idea is the intuitive part. That's where you come up with the idea of the three different kinds of cues with different sides, all that kind of thing. And then there's the playing out of that idea. And as you said, he was like a kid playing, but once he established the idea, he didn't play with that until, that was realized just as it was. He didn't change it as he went along. So that's important to note. And I think where the tension between the idea and the object come in has to do with the fact that, for example, wall drawings, as everyone knows, they can be installed, realized, painted out, installed somewhere else. painted out, installed somewhere else. They can, move forever. It's not a one thing. What is the one thing is the certificate, and we'll probably talk about that later because I know Samuel brought that up. And with the structures, oftentimes he would have a structure refabricated. And this has been a real ongoing kind of interesting issue for conservators because for Sol, the value wasn't necessarily in the historic object. Like, this is the one, I made this particular cube form and it forever and ever has to be last, etc. There were occasions where perhaps it was damaged to the point where he would say, well, it just needs to be remade. It's not important to hold on to this old broken thing and try to make it look good, because the idea, it's the realization of an idea. And so we can realize that idea again, and it's just as valid. So it's going to be the same. So there is this inherent tension, and it's really interesting. One of the things that I get into quite a bit in my job is conversations with conservators about these issues of when it's actually okay and why it's okay when something needs to be refabricated or stripped and repainted or so forth.
Jenna, can you tell us about the process of installing a wall drawing? If I am a curator at a museum and I want to borrow a wall drawing from somewhere else, how do I start and what happens?
When Sol was alive and he was asked to install a wall drawing, a lot of it had to do with the site, and he would most often make a new work for a new site. So it would be site specific, and that's his connection to architecture. So you would send him the dimensions of the room, the dimensions of the wall, all kinds of particulars, and then he would create a wall drawing to fit into that space. And then he would send his assistants, one or two, depending on the complexity of the work. His top, very experienced installers would go out, and they would oftentimes create a team of local artists to help them out, and they would install the work according to the instructions, the diagram, and the instructions that they got from Sol. Sol would supply a working drawing that would be very specific. So either it was a language, if it was one of the early works that relied on language, then that would be kind of the working drawing. And if it was one of the later works from the 80s onward, where you had forms and ink washes and that sort of thing, then it would be an actual drawing, which the installers would recreate, oftentimes using tools like rulers and plumb lines. If it was a curvilinear drawing, they would probably project it and copy it. And then they would install it. And when your loan period was up, you would be bound to paint it out.
So taking that process into consideration, how would you characterize the role of the artist as seen in Sol LeWitt? Did he change the function of the artist or reposition the artist in the process of artistic production?
He was like, or he said, like a composer, where you create the score and then other people play it. So, basically, I suppose it did change the role. But as he said, he was fond of saying, years ago, there were studios where artists had all kinds of assistants who would paint different parts of the painting and so forth. So it's really wasn't a new way, but it did seem very fresh when it first happened in the 60s, fresh and exciting. But Sol was always deeply, deeply engaged in the process and in constant contact with his assistants as they were working on it. And the experienced people would know if some surprise did come up, there would be a lot of discussions with him and, how to resolve it and so forth.
I totally agree with you. I think that the art practices throughout the centuries have always been ateliers with, assistants making the works, and I know, say, oh, this is a real Leonardo, this is a real Leonardo, this is a real, it's like, and in the 20th century, modernism kind of, erased that a little bit. And it's true, now we pick it up as an architecture practice, but again, in the Renaissance, all these limits were not that clear cut. So I think he's like real art in a very global, practice approach.
Mm-hmm. The other aspect of it is the sense of community and collaboration that was really important to Sol.
Mm-hmm.
He loved having assistants and people that he worked with, and he would create this community around himself. And the idea of, or the actual event of installing the wall drawing with his technicians plus local artists and so forth. I mean, that was like a huge, beautiful kind of situation that everybody walked away from feeling really good and had made new friends. And Sol loved that when the assistants all made friends. And it's well known that he would give each of the artists, volunteers, a small drawing when they finished.
I love that notion of community. I mean, it's not only heartwarming, but buried in there seems to be a pretty deep critique of the notion of the heroic individual artist that had preceded him. So I wonder if there is, in a sense, not only a critique, but maybe a politics embedded in that notion of community.
Well, Christina and I are both nodding vigorously to that. And Sol he was a very ethical person, and he was an extremely democratic person. And when he traded with artists, when he traded with an artist that was of his same stature in the art world, there was oftentimes a sort of equality, monetary equality, and so forth. But he would often trade with artists who were not well known at all, and he didn't talk about value. He didn't worry about that sort of thing. He just enjoyed, this is another artist, look at what they're doing. His assistants were always got credit. The wall drawings, whoever installed them, first installed them. He was really an egalitarian person. And yes, absolutely didn't have a lot of use for the heroic individual at all. He really wanted to be one of the group.
I want to say something about that, because in my process of diving into his work, this is something like primordial for me, and is his human quality. And he's like non-egotistical, his generosity with, younger artists. Like, he helped so many people by, presenting, like, I don't know, like, to me, this is what greatness is. Like, when I see there's many people when you have this level of work and this level of humanity, that it's unbeatable. And Sol is like, today's world, which is very market driven and very commercial, and everyone is like, with their elbows, like trying to get ahead and everything. Learning about him, reading about him and his generosity, I think this has to be taught in art schools, because this is what art is. Art is for the good of society. It's not a personal thing to enrich yourself. It's like a philosophy. It's like in the tradition of centuries of what art is. If art is going to remain central to what makes us human, and it's not only going to be a commodity or a fashion thing or something, a trend or something to get power or money, then art will be destroyed. Great art will prevail by humanities and souls like that of Sol LeWitt. It's my opinion.
Well said, Christina.
Mm.
And it is it's absolutely true about Sol. I like to say that the mythology is true, because he really was as generous and as humble and as democratic and as warm as you hear the stories. And his collecting was a big part of that. He he used to say, well, he told me once, he said, we never imagined making money or being famous. That was not what we were doing. And when he started making some money, he always said he felt he just got lucky. And of course, we know better. He was brilliant. He deserved, the recognition that he got, but he felt that he got lucky. And he immediately, not only would he and other artists, they had a kind of underground economy in the early days where, if you sold something for $100, you took your friends out and fed them. And then he began buying, he's known for trading. He did a lot of direct trades with his peers, but he also bought work either from their studios, or like he was the first person to buy Jackie Ferrara's work from a show in 1974. And, he would buy that work as a way of being generous, of helping the dealer, helping the artist, encouraging the artist, spreading the money around. And that's what the collection was really about for him. And then he felt that if he's getting the attention from curators, then they can come and visit him and they can see all this work by other people. And maybe they will show those other people. And to the end of his life, when curators would come out here to Connecticut, we had many, many visitors, and they'd come to look at his work, and he'd say, take a look at the collection. Why don't you look at, we call the collection, the works by other artists. Look at it. Look at what the other artists are doing. Why don't you do a show of, the collection? It was really about that. Let's just spread this around.
He created an ecology, a community and an ecology.
Yeah.
Can you give us a sense of the collection? What's it composed of, and what can we learn about Sol from it?
Well, Sol began trading with his peers in the 60s, and he would stop into people's studios and just see what they were doing and then say, hey, you want to trade? Or, he just kind of look around. Joe Bear has a memory of him looking through a box of little sketches she had put aside. And sure enough, we have some of those in the collection. So it was constantly, this is his way of kind of being in touch with people. And the collection, he never thought of himself as a collector. And he didn't want to be that. He didn't set out to create a certain kind of collection. He didn't go shopping for work. He didn't worry about what historic gaps might need to be filled in his collection. He acquired work through who he encountered in his life. And that's what makes the collection really special. These were friends, then they were people he met, and sometimes he would meet somebody and, oh, you're an artist, you want to trade. And then through his dealers, he was never, during his lifetime, he was never exclusive with a gallery. So he showed at galleries all over the world. And oftentimes when they sold his work, he would take that money and turn it right back around and buy works from the gallery by other artists. So this is really what the collection is about, with people who showed at the same galleries as him, people he met through other artist friends and dealers and so forth, his assistants and so forth. So there's a huge range. There's major, important, wonderful works in the LeWitt collection, and there are also wonderful works by unknown people in the collection, and everything in between. And what surprises people so often when they first visit the collection is that it's not all conceptual or minimalist work by any stretch of the imagination. He liked what everybody was doing. He was interested in what everyone was doing, and there's this great range of work. And every time he acquired a new work, he would show me, and he would be so pleased and excited. And it wasn't like, look what I have. It was like, look at what so-and-so did, and it was always a lot of things hanging in the house. And he would say, oh, why don't you take this down and put that up? And in fact, he has about 4,500 works by artists in the collection. And in 2001, I believe it was, he was asked to curate a show from the collection. He was actually asked to show his work at the New Britain Museum of American Art. And he kind of at the last minute said, you're giving me all this space and everybody here has seen my work before. Why don't you show the other artists from the collection instead? So he curated a show, and he remembered everything that he had. I mean, he chose, it was over 100 objects. And he, on paper, this was another brilliant thing about him, was he could think three-dimensionally on paper. He always mapped out his shows on paper. So he mapped out where everything hung. He hung it salon style. He clustered the sculptures in a kind of island of pedestals in the middle of the room, completely unorthodox and absolutely beautiful. But he arranged everything in this show. So that's how engaged he was with the work in his collection and how much he wanted to give it exposure.
Finally, I was going to ask what LeWitt means to artists today, but you're both practicing artists. So what did LeWitt make possible for you?
For me, being an artist with an architectural training, seeing that I could see what kind of artists I can be and how my education and who I am, because I always was between art and architecture since I had to go to university. I didn't know what to do, but the Beaux-Arts school seemed kind of like dull, you know. But I always like, am I an artist? Am I an architect? And like suddenly Sol and many others, not many, but some other artists like this, it gave me permission.
I've gotten to work with Sol's objects and other people's objects as objects, because as a collections manager and curator, I turn them over, I open them, I turn them inside out. We do, all kinds of handling goes on. And so I've learned that art isn't something that you stick up on a wall, someone sticks up on a wall, and then you go to a place and you stand in front of it and look at it. I mean, it can be that, but that it is really a living, everything is a living object. The slip of paper has a front and a back and dimensions. And so that kind of real embodiment that every work of art has influenced me deeply. And Sol himself, of course, many influences from his work itself, and permissions given for sure, but also the privilege of seeing somebody the last 16 years of a long career putting one foot in front of the other. And that's exactly what he did. And being courageous, which has given me the courage to do exactly the work I want to do, whether or not whoever receives it well or otherwise. And just to keep moving through my own body of work and doing what I need to do. That's how he was. He got up every day. He wasn't a hand wringer. He put one foot in front of the other. He was courageous. He made what he needed to make, and he put it out in the world and let the chips fall where they may, essentially. And also the idea of community that he developed has influenced me deeply. If there's one thing I have, if it's not going to be fame and fortune as an artist, it's a life in art as a community of people who think and appreciate the same kinds of things. So, my association with him and his work has just affected me very deeply as an artist and as a person.
Well, I think that note of community and courage is a wonderful place to bring this to a close. I'm just so grateful to have you both here to talk us through the many sides of Sol with the kind of deep layers of complexity that are underneath. So thank you both.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure meeting you, Janet.
It was a pleasure. Thank you both.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Perspectives, a podcast from Zeit Contemporary Art. Until next time, I'm your host, Samuel Shapiro.